So there's a lot of concern in Sacramento about whether we can open schools and do so safely. And if not, what measures are going to be put in place to allow students to have the best experience possible. We recognize that distance learning was very problematic when it was rolled out in the spring, and it's no substitute whatsoever for on-campus instruction. And like the president has expressed, like the governor at times has expressed, we are eager to get back on campus as much as possible, as soon as possible, if it's safe. We just don't want to go back by any means necessary and at any cost. And right now, the consensus is that most school districts don't have the measures in place to allow for the safe resumption of on-campus instruction.
One of the things the governor expressed concern about in one of his daily briefings, he talked about the cost of going back to school safely, and that right now, due to the pandemic and all the related shutdowns and everywhere else, that it was going to be really hard to really fund a complete cleaning and making it a safe environment. Has that changed at all?
No, the cost of resuming school safely is still one of the big barriers to having students and staff back on campus. I talk to people casually and in the course of my professional work, and a lot of people think that distance learning would be easier, or that it would be easier to go back to campus, and neither is really true. Both models have significant costs. If you're talking about reopening campuses to full-time instruction, you have to consider, are you implementing social distancing measures? If you do that as recommended, then that's going to mean fewer students in each class. That means more classrooms. Do you have enough facility space to accommodate more classes? If you have more classes, you need more teachers. Do you have enough teachers? If not, are you able to hire teachers in this very difficult environment where many people are rightfully concerned about going to work? Transportation, also an issue. A lot of the countries that have gone back to school have implemented social distancing on buses, 1 or 2 kids per row. If you do that, you're going to need more buses. Can you buy that? Or you're going to need more bus routes. If you have more routes, then you're going to need more drivers. That's another expense. Sanitation is a very daunting challenge. You're going to have to clean down after every class, multiple cleanings per day, as well as deep cleanings in the evenings and the weekends. So there's a tremendous amount of cost related to that. And districts haven't received the support yet to enact those measures. We don't have the PPE. There's no guarantee of when it will arrive, if it will arrive, and if so, will it arrive in appropriate volume for what we need? Since people started making these plans, the course of the virus has shifted a lot. Just in the past 2 weeks, a month ago, people weren't anticipating that we would be in a situation where the virus was raging to this extent. We made the decision to reopen, and we understand there were some economic and social pressures behind that decision, but we did that before we had completely contained the virus. And now we're facing a situation where if you had to reopen schools, you're doing so in an unprecedented fashion. Because every other country that resumed school, and some of those have had to close schools a second time, by the way, but all those other countries only resumed school once the virus was contained and community spread was very low, beneath recommended levels. Nobody else in the industrialized world has tried to reopen schools when community spread was increasing. And so that's why we're very concerned. There are probably some schools, particularly in remote areas, where they have plenty of space, where the virus isn't as prevalent, where they might be able to open if that's what their communities want and that's what their local health officer suggests. But for the bulk of schools across California, it's going to be very difficult, and we don't think that they have the funding, the support, or the capacity to implement these recommended safety measures.
Having the challenges that still exist when it comes to going to an all virtual environment, how do you suggest that schools try to tackle that?
First, I think transparency and honesty is the foundation of a good relationship, and schools need to be straight up with their communities that distance learning is not a great substitute, an appropriate substitute for in-person instruction, but they are taking this step because they believe that health and safety is the foremost priority, and they can't jeopardize the health and safety of students, staff, and community. Once you've established that you know distance learning is suboptimal, they need to reassure their communities that they are not taking this as an excuse to just pack it in for the year, and that they are going to pour all their energies into trying to address deficits in distance learning. That means working with the state, possibly working with private partners and corporations to try and get internet access to students who do not already have it, and to get Chromebooks or other laptops, internet accessible devices in the home, so the digital divide is mitigated as much as possible. They need to pour a lot of effort into training and professional development for teachers. We have a lot of great teachers who thrive in the classroom setting, but a lot of what makes a great teacher is that presence that they have when you're in the room. That's lost to some degree online. So you're helping these people who have a great experience and skill set in the classroom adapt and transition that to online modes. That's something that schools need to put a lot of work in.
What kind of concern is there when it comes to potentially having kids regress or fall back a little bit due to that virtual environment? Like you said, I'm sure there's many kids, you know, that are very focused and driven, and you put a task in front of them and they can do it. But as you said, there are some that really require that sort of one-on-one instruction.
Some districts in Kern County fall into this category that are proposing multiple models where certain students who are seen as high risk may be allowed on campus, or there may be some other special modes of instruction to supplement what's happening online. And that's certainly something for school districts to consider. Another thing that districts are looking at is when we finally do make it out the other side of the pandemic, will there be some sort of supplementary learning in terms of expanded summer school, weekend classes to help with remediation or to bring students up to speed? I think a lot of that is going to depend on how long the pandemic lasts, and then also on the funding that schools receive, both from the state and federally. I know there's a big push to try and do something in Congress that would provide more relief for the country as a whole, with specific sections that would provide additional funding for education. There was a bill earlier which passed the House and died in the Senate, but since the President and the Secretary of Education recently have talked about their desire to get schools open as soon as possible, I think there's been renewed interest in Congress about taking up some of that legislation. We're certainly pushing for that, you know, as our labor partners and other people here in California, but we can't count on that. And right now our schools have a budget which has been patched together with a lot of deferrals, an unprecedented number of deferrals. So schools will be receiving essentially the same money they received last year, but they won't be receiving it in a timely fashion. So there are cash flow management issues that districts will have to deal with there. And then also a lot of the budget is based on the presumption that we will be receiving these additional relief funds from Washington. If those don't come, then cuts will be triggered. And so that's going to affect just the means that districts have to address some of these issues with above and beyond services. But certainly schools need to have multiple contingency plans in place. One, if they receive additional money, one based on the current budget, and one based on a budget that may be less due to cuts. And they need to prioritize getting services to students and families. And so if they do have to tighten their belts, it should be normally we say as far away from the classroom as possible. But in this case, we're saying as far away from the students as possible. So anything that you can do to augment your distance learning capabilities, that's where schools need to be focused right now, as well as on mental health. That's an issue that sometimes gets overlooked. But you have a lot of students who rely on their school for support, who may be living in extreme poverty, and school is an escape for them. They now no longer have that outlet. You have students who are in abusive homes or who may be suffering from mental illness that is treated or addressed in some manner at school. So districts also need to look at how can they be proactive in reaching out to those students, to partnering with community-based agency, third-party providers to supplement what they can do internally and make sure that these kids aren't falling through the cracks.
What is it going to take as far as the progression in the coronavirus and fighting it and trying to find some sort of a cure or vaccine for it in order to get students back on campus when it comes to the California School Boards Association?
I think at a minimum, we would need to have assurance that every school district in the state has the proper supplies and support needed to implement social distancing. It needed to provide every student and teacher with a proper PPE as recommended by the CDC and the California Department of Public Health. And then we need to be able to get kids to and from school safely, to keep them safe while they're at school, and not create an environment where we have people who are spreading the virus, who are infecting at-risk populations, who are infecting parents and community members. Ideally, we have a vaccine, but we know that's tricky business and we can't rely on that. But the things which are within the control, or should be within the control of a state this large and this prosperous and of the world's most powerful nation, is getting PPE, getting sanitation systems to our schools. That shouldn't be too hard for California.
All right, Troy Flint with the California School Boards Association. Appreciate your comments and insight this morning.
No problem. Thanks for having me.